Um, to give a little bit more of a background on my nonprofit experience, um, even though I'm the development associate for LBF now, and I've had some other specific jobs that were focused on fundraising, a lot of my background is working for nonprofits that don't necessarily have a development team and that required us program staff and other staff to engage in fundraising. And I understand that that's kind of the situation that a lot of our grantees are in now. So I wanted to be able to kind of speak to that, not just what a development staff would do when it comes to fundraising, but also how you can fundraise in the absence of development staff. So my previous roles have been for small nonprofits around Louisiana, and we've engaged lots of different types of fundraising to support our mission. So we're going to cover a lot of different types of things today. Um, so if you go to the next, Renee's going to run my slides for me too, by the way. So I'm going to be directing her. Our first slide is going to cover kind of just an overview of what we want to talk about today. Fundraising in uncertain times, diversifying fundraising sources, fundraising without a development staff, as I said, engaging board in fundraising. That was actually something that a lot of you asked about in our survey. So I'm happy to be able to touch on that. The importance of donor stewardship. And then the last slide just has a few additional fundraising resources because there are lots of ways you can fundraise that we're not necessarily going to cover today. And a lot of that tips and tricks on grant writing and things like that can be found in lots of other different areas that don't really require anything like this. So I didn't want to waste time on that today, but I wanted to include links that you can go to learn more about that if you choose. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm laughing at myself because I'm waiting for the slide to change on my computer, but it's not gonna. So the three things we want to focus on when we're talking about fundraising in uncertain times, um, not just in political times like we are now, but anytime your organization is going through an uncertainty when it comes to one of your main fundraising sources. Not us, but some other of your sources we know, especially those that are tied to federal funding, are a little precarious right now, or maybe not as guaranteed as they were before, and you're not really sure which direction things are going to go. So we really um, recommend focusing on resilience and diversifying those fundraising streams so that you're not so reliant on those main sustaining sources of fundraising, or at least to have other funds to float you through until your solution that you're going to find for your next source of sustaining fundraising. So you want to really be engaging all those resources and get all the boots on the ground to make sure you're doing everything you can to continue the work you're doing. Um, and that really requires remaining optimistic. I think there's been a lot of panic in the nonprofit world lately around what direction fundraising is going to go. But if you have a really secure and solid donor base of individual funders that you can call on, that never goes away per se. And that's not tied to any kind of deliverables. And that's not tied necessarily to the political climate. And being able to remain optimistic about the fact that individual funders are still going to necessarily give regardless. Even if it's less, it might be less some years, it might be more. But we're even like for donor trends right now for 2025, they're actually, which I meant to put a link to this information at the end, but I'll send it after. But donor trends for 2025 are actually showing that individual giving is going to stay consistent or even improve despite the federal funding cuts, just because that we know some tax policies are going to change and some people will have more money to invest. That impacts the stock market, that impacts personal philanthropic giving. So there's a lot of different moving parts that are happening that can be detrimental to fundraising, but can also present new opportunities that we didn't have before. So an important part about fundraising in uncertain times and also just ensuring that your organization stays funded in uncertain time is planning for resilience. We don't really want to think about this in a small or in any small business or organization doesn't want to think about this, but you really need to be thinking about what is your worst case scenario budget and who on staff do you actually need to run your programs and meet your deliverables and who are auxiliary. Not necessarily thinking like layoffs or anything, but just thinking through a lens of if I have to prioritize a certain type of fundraising, what do I need to be going after? So, from the lens of nonprofit, especially those that don't have development departments, a lot of the focus is on program based funding that would really require an actual backbone of the organization to already exist in order for that program funding to be able to be deployed and actually be effective. So when you know that your potential operations funding is going to be in jeopardy, you want to be focusing on how to beef that up, knowing that the program funding can come later when you know that the backbone of your organization is strong. Um, so you want to make sure that um, having that focus on having all of your different programs kind of applying for their own funding in silos and figuring out what to do with that in silos is not the case. You want to make sure that all of your program staff are thinking toward thinking through the lens of sustaining the organization. And we'll talk more about what it looks like to have all boots on the ground later. Um, and then alternative funding sources, that's going to be a big chunk of what we go over today. So it's a good opportunity to start thinking about building that donor base for long-term sustainability. And like I said before, one good thing about individual giving is that it can usually be used for anything unless you set it up to be otherwise. It's unrestricted funding that you can use to help float your organization, even when maybe your program funding is solid and maybe your operational funding isn't. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So, what does it look like to diversify your funding sources? This is just a short list of hundreds of different ways that you can engage donors. Oftentimes in our personal lives, we hear that diversifying your sources of income helps create resilience in your personal life. You want to have those extra little nest eggs to help carry you through in case you were to get laid off or whatever the case. The same goes for a small business or a nonprofit. This can be scary for nonprofits that rely on major sustaining grants from orgs like us. But you want to be able to lean on less politically rooted ways of funding or let, again, not us. We're not going anywhere. Renee will let you know when or if you ever have to worry about that. But other types of funding, I just want to make that clear. I don't want it to seem like we're giving y'all ways to resource funding in case we go away. That's not what it's about. Um, but basically, just even though it can be scared to think about, you really have to think about that possibility in order to get in the mindset of what you would really need to do to help sustain yourself through these times. So it's good to start thinking about how to cultivate those individual donors. So the different ways where I'm going to go into detail about all these annual appeals, social media, peer-to-peer fundraising, community business partnerships, workplace giving, and special events. I just realized I didn't make a slide on workplace giving, but we can talk about it a little bit. We can go to the next slide. So this is an example of our annual appeal. This was the exact email that went out. I just copy and pasted it onto here for y'all. But an annual appeal is a yearly fundraising campaign where we send out communication, usually in the form of email, sometimes through snail mail and through social media. All you're going to engage all of your different platforms, and reach out to your donors asking them for financial support. Often it is timed around a season or an occasion at LBF. Like, as you can see, this is our year end appeal. A lot of people do spring and year end. It just depends on how you want to do it. I recommend being able to do at least 2 annual appeal asks per year. Um, the thing about annual appeals, a big misconception about fundraising is that you're asking people to give you money that they otherwise would keep for themselves. And that's not actually the case when it comes to nonprofit fundraising. And building a consistent donor base is more about targeting those people that you know already have plans to donate anyway. So your target audience are going to be people who already have a budget for philanthropy and are already looking for the easiest way to donate that makes them feel good and is easy to write off on their taxes. So the good thing about annual giving, and especially when you're doing it consistently 2 or more campaigns a year, is that people who do have a budget for that and who know about your organization or who start to continually get these, you'll be in the back of their mind when it comes to when they think about this. They know that you're going to give them an opportunity to donate at least twice a year. And I included our email here because another big thing about keeping these donors is the consistency and convenience. So you want to have this opportunity where they don't have to seek out a way to give you money, because you're going to make sure they have that opportunity in their inbox already. So they know that they don't have to worry about reaching out to you and making a donation to you, because that email is going to come through. And then all they have to do is click that link and it's going to bring you to the fundraising page. Renee, can you click that link? I hope I tried to set it up to where you can. And Renee, if she can click the link and show the fundraising page, like just if you click the second picture, does it pull up for you?
Yeah, so it's not showing the web page.
Okay. Yeah. Is it?
Yeah, can you see that?
Okay, cool. So basically that I just wanted to show y'all that, like, the ease of the way that that email comes through to their inbox. They click that page. All they have to do is, you want them to be 2 clicks away from being able to give you their money. You don't want to make it hard. So that's just an example of how easy you want to make it. And of course, your messaging will be different. Everything will be suited to your organization, but this is just an example. Another thing that LBF does, so I'm like constantly learning. Every nonprofit is different and opportunities will be different. And something that I learned from LBF development is that at the end of the year, we always send out year-end tax receipts for our donors. So they don't have to worry about keeping up with the donations that they make to us. They know that that email is going to come through. They're going to click it. They're going to donate. They're not going to have to worry about it until in January. They're going to get a statement of every donation they made to us that year, our tax ID number, the tax deductible amount, and everything. That way, that's just another convenience for them that they don't have to worry about, that makes us a desirable donor for them to work with. It just kind of takes it off their plate. And every little way you can make it easier for people to give helps. Go to the next slide, Renee. I think I might have gotten ahead of myself a little bit, but these are just little pointers for me to go over. Okay, I didn't get ahead of myself. Great. So the benefits of the annual appeal. So this is something that you can use to cast a net. Every single client, community member, anybody whose email address or home address you have access to you can send the annual appeal. It's something that is really common in our society. People are used to getting these, and it's an easy way to make a hard ask that oftentimes feels random. Um, and that consistency, again, will have people expecting it to happen. Let me see where I had put. Okay. I keep wanting to mention email versus snail mail, but I have that in my next slide, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Sorry. Um, so the annual appeal, I'm not sure who I spoke with, but some of our grantees were involved in Giving Tuesday this year, and I had a short conversation with one of our grantees about whether they do annual appeals and what their fundraising kind of looks like. And they said they don't do annual appeals, or that they don't necessarily have a donor base for that. And the, being able to tap into a resource like Giving Tuesday, for example, can be a good way to start. But at every time you have any kind of educational event, anytime, even like I said, even your clients, this is not a big ask. So anybody in your network at all gets put on this list for your annual appeal. And so every time you're sending out an annual appeal, ideally that list is going to be growing. And then from that list, when you get those annual appeal donations in, at first it might not be a lot. And that's another thing that organizations are not really aware of or fail to recognize, that the first couple of times it might feel like the return on your investment with annual appeals, and I just mean a time investment because it doesn't have to cost money. The first few times it can feel like the return wasn't worth it, but it's the consistency and the repeated contact and the growing of that list that's going to make your annual appeal more successful and create that donor base over time. So once those donations come in, you'll be able to identify some people who are a good opportunity for either major gift donors, like say, and by major gifts, especially for a small organization, we're talking $500, $1,000, anything. $10,000 is a lot, I think a lot of times when we think of major gifts, we think of 30,000, 100,000. But when we're talking about major gifts from an individual level, you want to be reaching out to people who give pretty much $300 or more, and just making sure to give them an extra love, and making sure that they have an opportunity to donate more if they want. You never know when someone is only donated 500 because that was the highest number they could click, and they might have clicked 1,000 if 1,000 would have been there, for example. So you always want to connect with those donors, thank them, ask them if they have a connection to your mission or how they heard about you, and get to know them. That relationship building piece helps with identifying who can be a more long term, a bigger or long term sustainer. Um, Even people who don't give a major gift, if you see that someone consistently gives to all of your campaigns throughout time, even if they only give a small amount, that might be a good opportunity for starting a program where you can have people who donate monthly. Um, I, even as a nonprofit employee, even back in my early years of nonprofit, when my salary was very low, I was still willing to give $5 to an organization that I really believed in every month, that I knew I was going to support, and I believed in their work, and they were staying in touch with me. And I felt good about that $5 going out every month. So you never really know who can be a good opportunity to like provide that solid donor base. That solid donor base is not just going to be those high level donors, but also those low level consistent donors. Um, so a benefit to the annual appeal that it is that it can be low cost and minimal effort. Email, you can send an email That doesn't cost you anything extra to your organization. If you want to just stick to email, and that's completely free, and all of that return will be just based on the amount of staff time it took. And like I said, donors will know when that opportunity to donate is coming. They won't have to put a lot of thought into it, and you'll be on their radar. Um, let's see. I'm just checking my notes to make sure I went over everything that I wanted to cover. Okay, that's it. We can go to the next slide. So, tips and tricks. Where to start? I kind of mentioned that earlier. If you don't feel like you already have a large list of people who are already ready to be asked for a donation, you can start engaging your community through these already set up structures like Giving Tuesday. In New Orleans, we have Give NOLA Day. I know that there's a South Louisiana Giving Day. I think there's a Central Louisiana Giving Day, etc. But it kind of creates an infrastructure for you to kind of hop onto to be able to test drive an annual appeal that will allow you to use the people who donate or interact with that outreach to kind of start building that donor base. It feels weird sometimes to reach out and ask for donations from people who are involved in your organization through in a different capacity, like volunteering or otherwise. But that's a good way to kind of break the ice and turn a non-monetary supporter into potentially a monetary supporter. Um, Consistency and convenience is key. I covered that before a little bit with making sure that you're sending it out on a schedule. It doesn't have to be the same exact day every year, but in the same season, and that you're getting those acknowledgement letters back quickly, and that you're making it very convenient for them to donate. Um, Now, I'll actually will talk about email versus snail mail now because I am emphasizing the fact that email is free, and that will allow you to outreach to infinite people. And that way your return on that, no matter how small or big, is worth it. You don't have to worry about it too much. But if you are able to identify a group within your demographic of people who would support you, who you don't think email would reach, and you believe that potentially investing in in actual mail will provide a return, there are some instances where that's um worth it. Like if you, for example, if a lot of your supporters are elderly, if you have another campaign, or if you have other evidence that shows that people respond well to that. For example, at LBF, we did some of our annual appeals are only email, and some of our annual appeals we send in return envelopes so they can return a check. We know that our members and our actual supporters who are attorneys a lot of times like to be able to receive that invoice. They can give it to their administrative assistant or whoever pays the bills in their office, and they can cut the check easily. That works for them. We get a lot of membership registration renewals through those checks, when that if we would have sent an email to that person, it might have gotten buried. So that's something that you can kind of decide within your team and within your supporter base if you think that would be worth it or not. But the email is, I mean, the snail mail is a little bit more of a monetary investment. But like I said, depending on who you're outreaching to, it can have a really high return. And you don't have to think of it in terms of all or nothing either. Like I said, you can send an email out to everyone and then choose a smaller subset of people to follow up with via mail. But I know a lot of nonprofits, especially those who don't have development departments, also don't have a big budget to invest into fundraising as well. So I just want to be mindful and acknowledge that. So you want to, when you're doing these annual appeals, in addition to the convenience of it all, you definitely want to be highlighting your impact stories. Most of y'all are really great at storytelling from what I've seen and using your impact stories to garner support in your community or at least show why you're important and also raise awareness to your potential clients about what you do, but we want to make sure that those impact stories are also showcasing the positive impact of past donor support and kind of also appealing to donors as well. Um, the immediate recognition of the donation, we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth when we talk about donor stewardship and retention, but making sure that people receive acknowledgement immediately when they make a donation is really important. You want the experience of donating to be fresh on their mind when they get that thank you. You want those things to be tied together, not I totally forgot about making that donation and now a thank you card is coming in and I'm like, oh yeah, you want that thank you and those warm and fuzzies to be connected to the act of donating itself. Um, okay, we can move on to the next slide. Maybe I should actually, because the next slide we're moving on to social media. So I actually, maybe I'll give a little time here in case anyone has any specific questions about annual appeals or comments. Do any of, I'll ask this. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but does anyone do an annual appeal that you feel is successful that you feel you could share some tricks and tips that have made your annual appeal successful? Okay. Well, we can move on to oh, email versus snail mail. What about it?
This is Greg LaCour. Um, the in my experience with nonprofits, um, the snail mail oftentimes gets a response from people that are older or don't use their email, right? And so, but the snail mail costs some money to produce. Um, where's the balance, I guess?
That's a good question. That's going to be different for every organization. Like that was a good example that I mentioned earlier about an older population.
Right.
Um, if you, if any organizations have previous campaigns that they can analyze and see what, sorry, I got your question, Joel Helene. Um, so yeah, making sure that it's worth it is a big thing to pay attention to with nonprofit and when you have those small amounts of funding that you're spending. So if you can identify a small subset of your supporter group that would respond well to snail mail versus email, that's good. Like there's no point, for example, in sending snail mail to Gen Z. They're not necessarily going to open it. There might be no point in sending an email to an older generation. And also, like I said, for us, it depends on what their day to day looks like. For example, for us, if we're sending mail to someone at a workplace that we know that mail is definitely going to get opened, it's definitely going to get handed to the person that we're soliciting, that's a good opportunity. If you're mostly reaching out to households that are used to using their email and social media for those asks, that can be something that you focus on in that way.
Yeah. Okay.
And if anybody, does anybody else have any more that they would like to contribute to that? Karen says yes, they do an annual appeal every year. They do snail mail and with a small reply envelope. That's good too. We don't even provide the stamp, but providing the envelope helps. And with the email follow up and reminder. That's a good thing to mention, Karen, is buying the addresses. So that's another option if you aren't able or don't want to and have to build your own donor base from scratch and have the funds for that, you can purchase that as well. Tom, and I'm going to copy this Tom Aaron training. I'm going to put this to the side so I can send this to everyone once we get out of the chat as well. So, the workplace giving, I didn't touch on that. I can touch on it really quick right now. It's just there are lots, even if in our small communities, there are larger organizations or companies that do that steward giving within their organizations for their employees, and that can look like allowing them to have a pre-tax donation taken from their check and given to an organization of their choice. A lot of times the company will choose a few different options and the employee gets to choose what they want theirs to go to. And a lot of times companies will even do a match on that. That requires a little bit of research in finding out what companies in your area are willing to participate in that. But from the research that I've done on workplace giving, a lot, in fact, most of the funding that large corporations have put aside for matching those donations goes unspent. So being able to, one of the things that I've done in the past when I was in previous fundraising roles that were peer-to-peer based, which we'll talk about that, was having your supporters ask their employer about it or ask if they already have the workplace giving set up for their company. Ask if your organization can be a beneficiary or how they connect an organization in their community that they support to their workplace giving. And I can also include a link about that as well, because it does take a little bit of it's a little bit more bureaucracy than a lot of these other strategies, just because you have to be so aligned with the company or organization that you're planning it with, and it's contractual. It requires a lot more. So I'll put some resources once we wrap up on kind of where to start with the research for that, and maybe I'll think of some companies in our area that might be a good choice. Like if I were, like, I'm in New Orleans, but if I were to say New Orleans, I would say like Entergy, Ochsner, places that have 100 or more employees. A lot of times this is already built into their infrastructure to do this, and all you have to do is ask. And sometimes it's more complicated than that. So thank y'all so much for engaging. I appreciate it. Does anyone else have anything to contribute? And Carol shared the link. I hate that I don't know how to say this man's last name. Tom Link. Let's move on, Renee. Oh, wait, sorry. We didn't do social media. You're already moved on. Okay. So, social media, one second. This is another example where we want to make sure our social media is relevant, because when someone Googles us, you want every way for someone to find out what you do to be accessible. But another opportunity this presents, just like the kind of the email versus snail mail discussion is an opportunity to reach demographics that you would not reach with email or snail mail. There are lots of younger millennials and Gen Z who are entering the workforce, and not just them, but this is just a good example of people who are entering the workforce who are not necessarily being targeted as a source for fundraising. But they are being marketed to via TikTok, Instagram, etc., on other ways of how to waste their money on a million different things. And all of this is unnecessary spending. And I think that, and this is maybe a personal opinion, but I think that we underestimate their desire to bring their life further into alignment with their values by being able to make a small donation, do a volunteer project, etc. Like I said before, we don't have to ask for a lot in order to get a consistent donor who's going to work your organization into their budget potentially and be willing to support you anytime that you're looking for fundraising. So you want to just make sure that all of your channels are active and that they're speaking to the audience that you believe will be seeing it. So if you do get a lot of engagement from the retired community on your social media, that might be where you're targeting them. It might not be snail mail. My grandma has her iPad in her lap at all times. She would see something on Facebook or something on Instagram before she would see snail mail. So it's really all about your supporter base and how you can speak to them through each channel. You want them to be able to see your link for donating on your social media, see the impact that you're making on social media, and also that you're asking for money. I think a lot of times, this is really obvious, but in fundraising, we focus so much on being willing to ask because even though we're nonprofits and even though people know that we're not a for-profit company, that ask that we always need money no matter what is not implied. The ask is not implied to literally anyone. So you want to be showcasing the impact of your organization that makes them think positively of your organization, and you want it to be tied of how they can support and how they can give their money to support. So that explicit hard ask is always necessary. I think a lot of orgs do a really good job on social media of showing the impact they're making, but the ask isn't there explicitly. And so that's just something to consider when you're using social media as a tool for fundraising and not just in community engagement, because both can go hand in hand. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So peer-to-peer fundraising, the way a lot of you are really, really strong in community outreach and education, and peer-to-peer fundraising is a good way to leverage that outreach on the community level into a fundraising strategy. So how many of your community supporters or clients, even your clients who don't have a giving capacity, because we know that our clients mostly don't have any capacity for giving, but they do have social media and they do have a community, especially a lot of times, especially people who are less economically advantaged lean more on their community even. So that's a great opportunity for them. Not only are they great at representing what you do, but they can also ask their community to help support you as a way to help support them. Like, this organization has provided so much assistance to me over time. Here's a way you can help support them. Every dollar counts, etc. If you have 25 clients who are willing to try to get $25 from 25 people, that adds up. And that's the like bedrock of peer-to-peer fundraising, is the idea that you have a community that you can mobilize, and that doesn't have to be rooted in staff putting a lot of work into pursuing a large funding source. This does require work from staff, though, and volunteers who can create or more realistically adopt a framework for peer-to-peer fundraising, which I have a few links at the end that links to websites that provide like a free framework for peer-to-peer fundraising, and I got a how-to guide on basically how to set it up and what that infrastructure would look like. But it's definitely a way to keep people engaged, um, increase awareness about your mission at the same time as raising money. And then, as I said before, when it comes to that annual appeal, this is another way to be building up that base for that annual appeal. It might be that your annual appeal stays consistent every year and you try out different other strategies to supplement it and garner more and amass those emails for your year-end appeal. Or it might be that you want to do a peer-to-peer fundraising campaign every year. It can be you take a few years to figure out what works for you, and in the meantime you're building that donor base for your annual appeal. It all just depends on what your capacity is for your organization. Especially, like I said, we know your organizations are a lot of times running on kind of like a skeleton crew. And we want to be able to give y'all realistic opportunities for fundraising, not only opportunities that would work if you had a whole development department and money to fundraise, et cetera. Because if that were the case, you wouldn't need this training or want this training, right? So another thing to consider when it comes to peer-to-peer is just what the fundraising activities will look like. Will it be a competition between different groups? Will it be just a group effort to raise money by a certain time? How will those donors be recognized and celebrated? At my previous job, peer-to-peer fundraising was my only job. I did a whole campaign that was just rooted in peer-to-peer fundraising. And we had a celebration at the end where we honored our fundraisers, we honored the people that it impacts, and everybody had fun. But that is totally based on what your fundraising is, what your funding is for fundraising, how much money you're able to fundraise, and just if you have the staff and volunteer base in order to put on an event, essentially. But people can get really creative in engaging their community to support the cause. And they can even get local businesses, like I said before, with workplace giving, that I got a little bit educated on when I was doing peer-to-peer. Another thing that I got very educated on when I was doing peer-to-peer fundraising was the level of involvement that local businesses like to have in getting involved in that small fundraising efforts. So I think the next slide is going to talk about that. Business partnerships. We can go to the next slide, Renee. So those business partnerships, that's a low effort way of giving back, low effort for the business itself. And it's growing in popularity in the commercial sphere, like not small businesses per se. I have had a lot of success with small businesses, but think like franchises. It's a smaller business in its actual operating, but it's part of a much larger entity that has a lot of times has allocated funding for these types of endeavors. So in these give back type of situations, you can have it's either a give back or a profit share, like for $1 for every beer we sell on this night will go back to LBF, or 20% of our profits for this night will go back to LBF. Or for the whole month of September, Blood Cancer Awareness Month, X percent of this particular menu item will go back. We even had, for Blood Cancer Awareness Month, we even had little drink stirs with our logo on them. And if you got that specific drink, it was a Bloody Mary. If you got that specific drink, money goes back to support blood cancer, and you also are reminded of the impact. You have that little trinket, you're learning about the mission, etc. So that can be really effective, and depending on how easy the business is to work with, it can be very, very low impact, low effort for the organization. It usually just requires one staff member to stay in contact with those businesses and make sure that that stays consistent. Um, a lot of times you can calendar out these give backs throughout the year in one meeting. So it's not something that has to be continually maintained, except for maybe sharing on social media when it's time for them to do the give back. Um, so there can even be a whole year worth of give backs, and for each month you can kind of expect a certain amount after you have done it before. And while each of these might only result in a few hundred or a few $1,000s, sometimes it's another way to kind of provide a consistent stream of undedicated revenue. And it can also be an opportunity to identify a larger gift donor as well, especially when you're targeting small businesses. So a lot of franchises already have infrastructure set up to where all you have to do is apply for their give back, which that's really easy. And I've done it before myself, and you can get a lot of give backs that way and have them on kind of on autopilot for yourself. But also a lot of small businesses, I think we underestimate a small business's desire to be able to give back to the community, even if their profit margin isn't that high. And you never know when a business owner is choosing to engage in one of these fundraising give back opportunities because of their personal connection to the actual cause. So you always want to be talking to people, building relationships, and anytime you make a connection with a donor, you want to be having those conversations about what their motivation is and being able to kind of feel out whether they might be a good target for a larger donation or a more consistent donation. It could even be a matter of asking them if they would be willing to have a permanent item on the menu that provides proceeds for your organization. It can be anything. Let's see. I got a little off my notes, so let me just make sure I gave y'all all the info I wanted. Oh, I wanted to mention, especially with like I mentioned, Blood Cancer Awareness Month, when I worked for Leukemia and Lymphoma Society in September, we did like a big push. Like we had people we worked with throughout the year for give backs. But for September, for example, we tried to do every single day. Somebody in the city was doing a give back for us, and we tried to make it be like you can't go anywhere without seeing that logo. So that's another thing that you can kind of piggyback on, is the awareness month for your specific cause, and coupling that, increasing that awareness and advocacy with getting proceeds from your community. So it can be both. It can be learn about our legal services and also give back to us. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. A lot of our organizations already have special events that they put on every year. A crawfish boil hates to see us coming. We all want to be able to put on these small community-centered events that raise awareness for our community, give those warm and fuzzy feelings to people that we engage with. But oftentimes it's a missed opportunity for further fundraising engagement. Um, so it doesn't have to be a large event, as y'all know. In order for it to turn a profit, a revenue profit for the event itself, but more equally as important, or equally as important, is it's helping increase that public awareness and building a future donor pipeline. So many of our grantees have that community outreach efforts in place to ensure that their prospective clients know about their services. But just like I said with social media, is there that dual outreach effort to ensure that people who have that charitable giving goals are aware of the impact that they could potentially make, how their dollar could help make the difference, and how they could get involved in your org. Um, we need to be kind of thinking outside of the box when it comes to special events, because you can really, a special event is a nonprofit's expertise. Like, I feel that we nonprofits are really good at putting on a special event and making it an enjoyable event that people want to come to year after year. But it can also fill multiple different needs. It can also be a good opportunity for making sure that your board is engaged, for example, which we'll talk more about board engagement, but we want to see staff there. We want to see board there, and we want people to be talking about how you can further support the organization, not just how the crawfish that you bought today is going to benefit the organization, but how can you use these events to cultivate donors who will be more sustaining. So in having your board members invite a guest to the crawfish boil so that they can have a conversation over crawfish and beer about how amazing the organization is. And hey, would you think about considering this organization when you're budgeting for your charitable giving for next year? These are opportunities for not just the community members that you think of as not necessarily the money people to crowdsource that funding, but also just another way to steward donors. Um, so when I was talking about identifying the major gift donors earlier, um, using that annual appeal pool of major gift donors to specifically target people and say, hey, we're having this crawfish boil. A lot of the people that have been helped by our organization are going to be there, and a lot of our community partners are going to be there. We would really love if you come out and see the impact that your dollars are making and learn more about what we do. Donors like to be engaged with in that way, and you would be surprised at how many people would be willing to give more if you just ask. In these events, especially because they cost so much, and oftentimes that the profit margin can be kind of small, making sure that you're using these special events for other strategies is another way to make it feel like that money is kind of going the extra mile. So tips for special events, it can be a range of things: a crawfish boil, a community cook-off, some kind of other competition. This is a good example of how um, one fundraiser led to another kind of involvement, because we had a fundraising team who was one of our peer-to-peer fundraising teams. One of their family members owns an Italian restaurant, and they did what they called a meatball to raise money for us, where basically a lot of community members got together and had a meatball making competition, and whoever won got to be the winner of the meatball. But that kind of snowballed, and now they do it every year to benefit the org. It's its own event. And even though that particular group doesn't necessarily participate in that peer-to-peer infrastructure anymore, they still put that event on, and they could do it for any organization if they wanted to. So just kind of making sure you're not staying too far in the box on what that can look like. Um, Another way that workplace giving can be incorporated into this is if you engage businesses in the actual programming of the event. So if you wanted to have some kind of cook-off, you could engage local businesses in having kind of a team building event where they participate as a cook-off group and provide all the supplies and everything as a donation, and the proceeds go to your organization. There's so many different ways that you can do peer-to-peer fundraising, engage in givebacks, or do special events. It's all about creativity, and a lot of times those ideas come from the fundraisers in your community that are interested in giving back, and it's not something you necessarily have to brainstorm all on your own. So I wanted to, in between this, I wanted to go ahead and move into fundraising without a development staff, because special events and a lot of these other types of fundraising strategies do raise the question of what do you do when you don't have your own development staff. But I wanted to give an opportunity for people to, if you have any questions or comments about any of these specific types of fundraising that I said already, we can do that now. Or unless, let's see how many slides I have left. What do you think, Renee? Should we do questions again right now or just wait until the end? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, first of all, thank you, Ahern. And Facebook fundraising opportunities. I wouldn't say that you inherently should not trust them. A lot of times, legitimate fundraising platforms have a way for people to link that fundraising um, software to their Facebook. So I would say I would not inherently not trust them. A lot of them are legitimate. And I could maybe do a little bit of research on what the likelihood of them being phony are, or ways to identify a phony Facebook fundraising opportunity. But I know specifically with Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, our peer-to-peer fundraising platform that our fundraisers had to sign up through LLS specifically had an option for them to link their Facebook, and that money went directly back to LLS and did not even go through the hands of the Facebook person. So a lot of those are really legitimate, and I would even say could feel more legitimate than like a GoFundMe or something else, where you know for a fact that the money has to go through the hands of the person who is asking you for the money. Okay, we can move on. I do have one slide at the end that kind of, oh, here we go. Give for Good every May. Oh, okay, Give for Good is one of the ones I couldn't remember what it was called. Yeah, I think doing Give for Good in May. So, Lene, oh, hey, Lene, you asked, Lene says they do Give for Good every May in Shreveport, and that's basically their only fundraiser. And if I would recommend doing one at the end of the year, yes, that would be perfect. That can be your two kind of bookends for annual appeal. And that way, your people who did Give for Good, they'll hear from you again another time throughout the year, and they won't be waiting a whole year to hear from you again. And that can kind of help that can also, doing a year end after Give for Good, like for example this year, it can give you a good feel for whether your donor base that you built through Give for Good will be a good will be willing to give more, and if that's something that you can continue building, or if maybe that wasn't a good donor base for you to use for your annual appeal, and you might want to use a different type of fundraiser to identify those. But I would be willing to keep in touch on that and talk to you about it more, Lene. And also, I just want to say our conversation about giving when we had Giving Tuesday is partially why I'm doing this presentation. So thank you. Okay, we can move on to fundraising without a development staff. So I think a big question on this is who is left with the responsibility? Who is left carrying the bag? I think a lot of times the onus of fundraising can fall too heavily on a certain department. Not necessarily any certain department. It just depends on um, the organization and what the capacity of everybody looks like. But that can often lead to burnout really quickly when we kind of when someone is basically doing the entire job of another person when it comes to fundraising. So a lot of you who are working with that skeleton crew, I get it. Like I said, to begin with, my nonprofit background is built on small organizations that are built on tight knit communities, but don't necessarily have a huge staff. But that's something that you can use to your advantage. Um, it's something you can use to your advantage when it comes to fundraising, because that engagement requires everyone on staff to be involved. So I'm trying to say it's important to make sure that not just one department or one staff member ends up carrying that burden of development. And aside from the burnout and unfairness in general, is also just because, especially for a small staff in a tight knit community, everybody on staff should be able to speak to the case for support. Every person on staff and board, if confronted with a potential donor, should be able to explain why the funds are needed and how they would be used if they were to donate. Obviously, not exactly how every single dollar would be used, but you want people to feel really comfortable with um, being able to do a boilerplate explanation of what your organization does and a boilerplate way for people to give back. You know how when you're watching a show or listening to a podcast and they bookend every episode with their social media handles and how to support the show? Every staff member should be able to do that in a short conversation with a potential supporter about what y'all do. So if that requires training up all your staff and your board on that basic boilerplate language, then that might be something you need to do. But a lot of times, sometimes fundraising falls more on staff who are more comfortable speaking about it, more comfortable asking about it, and have more interactions with those particular people. But you never know when an opportunity is potentially getting missed. So we want to make sure everybody feels comfortable. And then communication is really key. I'm going to focus more on the role of the board in the next slide. I didn't want it to seem like I glossed over it, but a key part of making sure that a staff without a development team can handle development tasks is communication. You want everyone to be on the same page on whose responsibility is it to do what, especially when it comes to that consistency being key when it comes to annual appeals and other scheduled fundraising opportunities, or even with company givebacks. You want to make sure that everybody understands what their role is so that nothing falls through the cracks. You want those annual appeals to be consistent. You want those thank you letters to go out. You want that communication between departments to be really clear so that things can stay organized, because unfortunately, a lot of times in nonprofits or in any situation when it's like kind of like everybody's job and nobody's job, that is a really good opportunity for something to not get done or fall through the cracks. So thinking of it as a group effort, but also identifying which team members are going to be responsible for actual deliverables is really important. And that also having open conversations about that also helps to ensure that everything isn't falling on one person or one department to handle the development responsibilities. And so, how does the board play into that? We can come to the next slide, Renee. I think when it comes to engaging with our board, we have a tendency to, they're oftentimes very prestigious people. They're oftentimes people we greatly respect. They're people we often even want to impress. And so when it comes to a struggle, such as potentially struggling with fundraising, we don't really want to, you don't want to go to your board with a problem. You don't want to be able to have to tell them that you're struggling with something and missing the mark. But especially if you know you're doing everything you can, you want to be able to go to the board and give them some ideas on how they can be helping address the shortcomings of what a small staff can lead to. I want to take a moment to read what Karen said to everyone, that fundraising consultants are available to assess capacity and make recommendations. And I have a link to the AFP. There's multiple chapters in Louisiana of AFP as well that have a lot of resources for how to fill in these gaps, even board involvement in fundraising. I think those are great resources. Thank you, Karen. But yeah, I think we want to focus on the fact that our board is a resource for us, not just for decision making, but also when it comes to filling in these gaps. So we want to make sure that they know that being on the board is an honor and it is a responsibility. And board members, to an extent, do have a fiduciary responsibility to the org they serve, whether that's through a personal donation or donor cultivations. Like, obviously, they're not going to have a revenue goal, but it's not too much to ask for them to participate in fundraising. But again, you have to ask them to do it. It's never implied. They don't know that just because they sit on your board and love your cause and talk about y'all's mission every chance they get and how well you're doing, that doesn't imply that they're asking if their friends have any plans for their philanthropic giving that year, or that doesn't imply that they're going to write that check at the end of the year. So you also need to be making those explicit asks to your board to include you in their annual giving if that's something that they have access to financially, or to be mentioning your names in rooms of people. So aside from general giving opportunities that they can take advantage of, are they talking about the annual giving goals to their friends? Are they talking about the annual appeal to their friends and asking their friends about their annual giving goals, is what I was trying to say. A lot of times you think that that's happening necessarily behind closed doors because of the way that your board member interacts with you. But a lot of times it doesn't cross their mind and they don't realize that how much impact they can make just by having conversations with their own peers. And a lot of people who sit on boards have really philanthropic mindsets and also run in circles with other people who have philanthropic mindsets. So they can be a really good opportunity to capture those people who can be a sustaining donor for you. And some of your board members are not going to be the people who are going to help you with that. And you know that their strength and what they bring to the board is something totally different, and you don't want to ask them to be involved in fundraising, and that's totally fine too. That's part of that relationship building piece of whether you know your organization and you know your board members and what their best involvement is going to be. So I don't want it to seem like you're pressuring all of your board members to fundraise, even if they're bringing something else very valuable to the table, but to just not count that out of something that you can ask them to help with. And like I mentioned before, with special events, for example, is your board finding people that they know have money to invest and asking them to come to your personal event so they can talk about how amazing the organization is, how they're going to donate this much to this organization this year. Will you match it? Will you be interested in matching my donation? There's a lot of casual conversations that people can have that can be really beneficial to your organization if they're having it with the right person. Especially when you have, again, all that organization that doesn't have a dedicated development team. Other staff members are having to do fundraising on the side as well. And so having all of the boots on the ground can be very helpful to just bridging that gap of not having that dedicated development team. So I'm going to move on. Oh, here we have a question. Sachita, doesn't the nonprofit board play a vital role in setting fundraising goal, reviewing plans, and monitoring progress? If that's the case, should they be a part of that fundraising committee? Yeah, I agree. I do think that that's something to be discussed, especially because if they're not involved in how the money is fundraised, a lot of times that goal setting cannot be rooted in reality or fact. So them being involved in understanding what it looks like to fulfill those fundraising goals and especially to meet those revenue goals is very helpful on both ends to help meet those fundraising goals and to also help have more knowledge about the how realistic those goals are or how other ways the board can help um, provide resources to help to improve fundraising. Did that answer your question, or does anyone want to add to that? Okay, well, we can move on. My next slide is about donor cultivation and stewardship, a big part of what we've already been talking about. It's kind of a theme that runs through fundraising in um, any subject matter you're talking about when it comes to fundraising. That donor cultivation and stewardship is always going to be the bedrock of what you're doing. Building those sustaining relationships is really important. You don't want every ask to be a new conversation. That's why building that donor base is really important so that you know that you have people that are expecting you to ask and they want you to ask, and it's not creating a brand new scenario every time. So you want to focus just as much on stewarding your current donors as you are searching for other fundraising opportunities. So you want to make sure you're engaging your donors in other ways other than just asking for a donation. And that's when the special events can come through or inviting them, not even just a special event that you're putting on for fundraising, but any opportunity that you can invite a special donor that you know is interested in supporting your organization to see what y'all do and see what impact y'all make is a good opportunity to make them feel like they're part of the organization and to make them not feel like the only time they hear from you is when you want to ask for more money, even if they're a really good donor and even if they donate every time. Sometimes they don't want to only hear from you when you need more of their funding. Even if they know you're doing great work, you want to maintain that relationship. And so you also want to, you're getting a community of giving as well. You're not just seeking out these one and done opportunities for fundraising. Like we talked about before, like some of your fundraising events that you kind of do that you're thinking of as like a one and done event, or maybe it is an annual event for your organization, but you want to be thinking about how to turn everything you're doing into an opportunity to cultivate more donor. And cultivating donors is not just growing your donor base, but also exploring how to take a low amount donor to a higher amount, an occasional donor to a consistent donor. There are lots of different ways to cultivate donors without necessarily looking for the next person per se. And you want to make sure that every time you have one of these opportunities, you're thinking strategically about who's invited. You're asking your board to strategically invite people so that they can network and talk about what the organization does, et cetera. Like I went over when we were talking about the special events, you just want it to be that opportunity to showcase and network. And like I said before, this is kind of just drilling in. Every person on staff needs to have a mindset of identifying opportunities for funding. So whether that's giving training to your whole staff so they know how to talk about the messaging or how to deliver a proper ask, it's hard to ask for something. It's hard to ask for a donation, even when you're talking to someone that you know is going to donate. It's hard to ask for money, especially to people who are not used to asking for it. So it's important that everybody on staff understands that, especially in the absence of a development department, that funding piece is part of their work. Their work wouldn't exist without the funding, and that it is partially part of their responsibility to be able to act on an opportunity if one is presented to them. A good opportunity for this, for cultivating those donors outside of actual donating campaigns. Sorry, I've been talking a long time, y'all. It's starting to get scrambled. We're almost done though. So outside of just building that donor base through actual donation events, mixers, other people's galas, meeting, networking events, all of those are opportunities. So you want to make sure that when possible, because I know that our grantees are very busy and working with clients and actually providing the services that we're funding y'all to provide, and that a lot of this other auxiliary work is really hard to squeeze in. But when you share the workload among the whole staff, it's more feasible, but you want to be identifying those opportunities in the community to network with peers, not just executive directors or even director level employees, but all staff members should be empowered and equipped to be able to go to some of these events and talk about the organization and deliver that messaging, and potentially cultivate relationships with a prospective donor, especially in a low stakes environment. I'm not saying that everyone should be able to do the job of a development director, but just to be able to hold a conversation and get the point across enough to be able to connect them to someone who can talk to them about it further. That's all I mean when it comes to that. And then the thanking people piece, I really can't say it enough. I'm not a psychologist, but there is evidence that shows that you want to be able to thank people quickly enough to where when they get that thank you is not only making them feel really good about what they did, but they're able to think back to what they actually when they actually sent you that money. So that feeling of gratitude that they get when you reach out to them and tell them how important they are for donating back, that amount of time between that and back to the donation period is really important. Karen says 48 hours is recommended. Agree. 48 hours is really hard. So you really have to have a plan in place for thanking people at the same time as you're creating your plan to solicit people. Because yes, 48 hours is ideal. And a lot of times when you're already disconnected from the act of giving, by the time you receive the thank you, you're thinking about that organization positively, but those positive feelings are not necessarily directly related to when you actually click that button that said you're going to donate $500. Yes, it doesn't always happen, but if you strive for 48 hours and get it within a week, that's usually um, acceptable. Once you're getting into 2 week territory, they're already moving on to the next. So you really, that timing matters, and it can be stressful sometimes too. Um, my dog's telling me it's time to go. Okay, next slide. Recapturing today's topics, I just wanted to give us an opportunity to kind of, if anybody has any questions about all the things we went over or any suggestions, comments, anything. I've really appreciated everything that y'all have contributed today thus far. And so I wanted to make sure we get an opportunity to talk about that before we get off the call. And also if anyone wants to share any other input that doesn't have to do necessarily with the strategies that I talked about, but maybe a strategy that you would have maybe liked to see. I'm struggling to find my Zoom window again. Okay. Okay, well, we can go to the next slide, Renee, where I have some resources. So as someone said before, sorry, I don't remember who said, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, a great resource. The fundraising school provides great trainings, certifications if y'all are able, if y'all have development staff who are interested, and they also have a podcast. I really like their podcast because each episode is only about 15 minutes long, and you can get little snippets of information about what's going on in the fundraising world or different approaches to fundraising and stuff. So I like learning through podcasts. So if podcast is something that you enjoy, I highly recommend checking out the First Day podcast by the Fundraising School. And the rest are just different types of resources you can use to actually implement some of the different fundraising strategies that we talked about today, like classy.org and Just Giving. If you wanted to do peer-to-peer fundraising, there's infrastructure for that. Giving Tuesday, Volunteer Match. A lot of times you could do a lot more if you have the labor of volunteers. So even though we didn't talk a lot about volunteer cultivation, that's another thing that you can do for fundraising is have enable and empower your volunteers to fundraise as well. It's the First Day podcast. It's right here. I have it written. It's from the fundraising school, but it's right on the second line at the very end of the second line, First Day podcast. But that will conclude my presentation for today. If anyone has any more input, let me know. And I'll make sure to share all of the resources that everyone mentioned in the chat in addition to this slide of resources. And thank y'all all for attending.